What if there was one man that could possibly be the sole responsible person for this country being the economic and financial powerhouse that it is? Interesting. On today's Deeper History. Good morning. Today we are here with Mr. Cole Bostic, right here, one Horn Lake's very own. We're going to talk about one of our very interesting forefathers. Now, most of the time we think of American history, we tend to think of the political side of it only, okay? We think of Thomas Jefferson.
Right.
We think of
James Madison.
George Washington,
Right.
However, this country had several forefathers that are really responsible for it being the economic and industrial powerhouse that we are. We're talking about Vanderbilt, who bridged the entire country with the railroads. We're talking about Carnegie,
Right.
depending on how you want to say it, who was responsible for the steel, which is the way that all of our cities grew up to the skyline. Edison, solely responsible for all of the amazing inventions and arguably utilizing electricity
Absolutely.
to its fullest. And then, of course, Rockefeller, who brought us oil, and we still use his companies today. If you stop at the gas station, more than likely, it's one of the broken up companies that the government busted up from one of Rockefeller's large companies like Exxon and Mobil. So there's one other gentleman who could quite possibly, we never talk about him as much. However, in my mind, he might be more ruthless and more cunning and smarter than all of those dudes combined. And his name is J.P. Morgan. Tell us a little bit about J.P. Morgan.
So you think about Rockefeller, or you think about Carnegie, and there's basically two ways that these men were getting rich. There's horizontal integration, where you buy out your competitors, or there's vertical integration, where you're buying out all of your suppliers, you're buying out everybody. And then there's J.P. Morgan, who is not just buying out competitors or suppliers, he's buying out those people.
Sort of in a league of his own.
Absolutely. Yes. He is, he's all about the money behind the things. I think the number one thing we should thank him for is investment banking. He was not one of those that decided on an awesome invention and made a lot of money. He was, let's take a bunch of rich people's money, invest it the right way, and make change along the way.
Absolutely.
And ended up being one of the richest men in our history, right?
And probably a bigger picture guy. I feel like he's the guy that would see 5 or 10 plays ahead of everybody else.
Oh, of course.
And then everybody's like, what is that guy up to? He's like going around buying up all of these little poor companies.
Right.
And why is he wasting his money?
And it wasn't just one industry. You look at the railroad industry, you look at the early technology industry, you look at all these different things where they're going down because of different economic collapses, the Panic of 1873, 1893, 1907. He's standing there waiting on them to collapse so that he can buy up their stock and own them for when we rebound.
Yes, and let's back up a little bit now. The stock market has had multiple dips throughout our history. Mm-hmm. But for many of the earliest ones, he was sort of right there.
Oh, absolutely.
And some of it driving, from what I remember, he sort of drove a few of those dips on purpose in order to consolidate and make the industry a little bit more stable.
Yeah, so this time period, late 1800s, 1880s, 1890s, the government's not regulating anything. We don't see our first antitrust law until 1890 with the Sherman Antitrust Act. And so he knows what he's doing. He's sitting there waiting so that he can own pieces of a whole industry. And also, going back just a few moments ago, we were talking about different forefathers and different people. There is the business side, but he's also in the gap between. He's on the business side, but that doesn't mean that he's not friends with people in the government. He's closer to Grover Cleveland, who's the New York governor, who becomes president twice, non-consecutively, right? And so he's kind of involved with it all. And then was it the 1907 collapse, I think it was, where he ends up bailing out the government?
Actually gave the government a loan.
Yes, and he was sitting there waiting for this to happen, and then he bails the government out. Now, that's also, we have him to thank for that, but he also is being slick in doing that.
Oh, the government now owes him big time, and that gives him a lot of political clout, which is probably the reason that monopoly laws don't come to play earlier than they actually did.
Right. Well, and you think about the fact that monopoly laws are made by the legislature, right?
Absolutely.
And if the legislature is making enough money in cahoots with these guys, why would they change the law?
No reason to change the law at that point. Now, we talk about all of those other guys all the time, like Vanderbilt. We grow up at a very young age. Students in elementary school have heard the name Vanderbilt. They've heard the name Rockefeller. They've obviously heard the name Edison. We just don't hear about J.P. Morgan, and that's a little bit sad to me, which is part of the reason we're doing this segment today. J.P. Morgan built the company General Electric, and he did that by buying out Edison, and he was really very cunning about it. He basically threw Edison out of his own company.
Right.
So do you know a little bit about the backstory? What's basically the backstory of that? I know this. J.P. Morgan's father was very wealthy.
Right.
And he comes from a background of wealth, and J.P. Morgan's father was heavy into the banking industry, and if I remember, mainly in Europe. So he comes from a very esteemed family of bankers, and they really played it safe. His whole family played it very safe.
Right.
He was more into, let's see that next thing coming. So he made a play for Edison Electric, which his family was very much against.
Yeah, and his dad made a lot of money in London, and that's kind of where he gets started. And I think part of the reason that we study the other people as we're growing up, they're rags to riches stories. You know, you look at
and we love those.
Right, absolutely. It's
love
self-made men. And J.P. Morgan actually says that he professes to not being self-made. He knows it's his father's wealth and his father's friends' wealth that has made him. So not only does he buy out Edison, he then goes as far as to arrange the buying out of Carnegie Steel.
Right.
And we end up with the U.S. Steel Corporation. And so you see all of these buyouts happening because those guys can eventually, they're getting a little bit older, they can kind of merge their way out and be done. And then there's the whole philanthropic side of things that we could talk about. But then he's sitting there being the facilitator. He's not walking up to them with loads of cash saying, let me do this for you. He's walking up saying, here's the plan, here's how we're going to do it. He has a proven reputation and he does it. So it's not like he's, I'm going to go there for a moment. It's almost like a Donald Trump story where it's your father's wealth, it's your family's wealth that's building you, but then you're being really smart with it. And so you're making yourself even better, but you didn't start at the ground up. Right.
So two major companies that J.P. Morgan was really responsible for in the early days. First, General Electric. There was a fight between Tesla for AC, which is what we use, that's the electrical grid we use today. And then Edison was really big into DC power, or direct current, which is more of like what our car batteries run on. J.P. Morgan invested with Edison, and they were really good friends for a very long time. Edison outfitted J.P. Morgan's house in New York with electricity. Which
first electric
house in history. Really good friends. J.P. Morgan is a ruthless businessman, and asked Edison from the get-go, do you have any competition? Because that's one thing J.P. Morgan could not handle was competition. And he wanted to know it early because he wanted to be able to crush them early.
Right.
Edison was very arrogant, and we know this from a lot of different things throughout history that he was involved with. And he did not even want to mention Tesla's name. Tesla was an employee of Edison, if I remember correctly.
That's right, yeah.
And Edison was, I think, probably a little bit uncomfortable with how brilliant Tesla was. Tesla moved on and created his own electrical company and won some contracts, including the Niagara Falls power generator, which really ticked J.P. Morgan off. Tesla won the Niagara Falls contract. That really made J.P. Morgan mad. In the end, to make the long story a little bit shorter, J.P. Morgan ends up buying out through stock exchanges purchases enough of the Edison Electric Company to where he knocks Edison out. He crushes Tesla in the end because they go bankrupt. And he takes over the AC and DC landscapes and builds General Electric, arguably one of the biggest companies to this day
Absolutely.
on the planet. Then he moves on and decides that's not enough. I want to take over the steel industry. Now, Carnegie is a massive steel owner, and there are several other smaller steel companies around the country at this point, correct?
Right, that's correct. Carnegie is the one that's really leading that charge. So Carnegie had spent some time in Britain, and when the Bessemer steel process came out to inject iron with carbon to make steel, it was genius. And so he brings that idea back to America, and he is ruling that. Now there are some smaller steel corporations. Bethlehem Steel comes after this,
right?
A few others as well. But I would venture to say 3/4 of the industry is Andrew Carnegie is ruling this. But there's also something interesting about Carnegie that we should talk about as we merge into J.P. Morgan.
Mm-hmm.
So towards the latter part of Carnegie's life, he writes something called Wealth, and we now call it the Gospel of Wealth. And he basically says that there's 3 ways that what you should do with your money at the end of your life. And the third way is you should give it to the poor. And he ends up giving like 95% of his wealth away. I mean, one of the richest men, and gives it all away. But I don't think he would have been able to do that if he was still involved in the steel industry. And so when JP Morgan is able to buy him out, I think that's what opened the doors for him to be able to pursue that. I think had he not been able to, we would look at Carnegie as being slick, as being ruthless a little bit, like JP Morgan. So I think JP Morgan kind of took the heat for all of them, right, and was able to let all the rest of them pursue philanthropy. We talk about rich people during this time, and that's something that's often left out, is that yes, they are making the most money. Their working conditions are terrible for the average, right, and lower class people, but at the end of the day, many of them are giving their money back. And we see that in today's time. The Rockefeller Center, there's several universities established. I think University of Chicago is one of them.
Vanderbilt?
Yeah, Vanderbilt. Right, yeah, absolutely.
And what we didn't cover in all of this, which was there was a very, very, very ugly war between Rockefeller and Carnegie, mm-hmm, that stemmed from some early business dealings that the two of them were basically trying to outdo each other. I feel like Rockefeller was probably a little bit more ruthless and greedy.
Yeah.
I don't think Carnegie was. I think Carnegie amassed that wealth partly just to stick it in Rockefeller's face.
Yeah.
So that could very well explain the end of his life giving it away. It really wasn't about the money for him.
Right.
It was about the status.
Well, and it's interesting too that Ida Tarbell, right, gets involved. She's a muckraking journalist. She gets involved and starts really researching Standard Oil and Rockefeller, and she was able to discover some things and then publish some things in McClure's magazine to where the public knew about it. So as that's coming out, we're seeing how ruthless Rockefeller is. Carnegie really didn't have anybody pursuing him like that.
Right.
And if they did, I really believe they wouldn't have found anything. Right. But then you move on into JP Morgan, and again, JP Morgan's sitting there waiting. He knows these guys at their end of the ropes.
He knows all of his opponents very well. Probably, arguably, he knows them better than they know each other. Mm-hmm. So he smells some blood in the water and decides, I think I can take all of these small steel companies around the country and also take Carnegie, mm-hmm, buy them all out, and consolidate them and build U.S. Steel. Now, what happens is he asks Carnegie straight up, or he actually sends a messenger to Carnegie and says, would you do it? Give me a number. And Carnegie sends him a number that Carnegie does not believe anybody would pay, and he certainly does not believe J.P. Morgan has the money to pay it, and never thought in a million years he would pay it. J.P. Morgan immediately sends word back, it's done. And then they meet for the tune of $480 million. Now, in today's money, I'm not an economist. I would have
dollars.
Yes,
right.
that would be an
That is
incredible amount.
That's a wealth that we'll never know. Right? Correct.
You're probably right. Billions. That, mm-hmm, would be in the billions in, right, today's money. And then basically they have lunch and the deal is done. And JP Morgan works to consolidate U.S. Steel.
Right. But I want to emphasize that it's not about the industry, right? So JP Morgan's not like, oh, I love steel. Or, like, he's not all about, the Bessemer process and how neat it is, right? He's not, even when he saved the railroad companies 10 or 15 years before this, he doesn't love laying track, right? Like, it's not his thing. His thing is investment banking. And so he shows up. It doesn't matter what the industry would have been. If it's a mass industry, if it's making a lot of money, he wants a hand in that.
Right.
In today's time, it would be technology, right?
Correct.
It would be even little things. You look at Uber, or you look at the things that are leading the charge in a 2018 world. He would have had his hand in those. He doesn't care at all about the next greatest phone, but he does care about the investment banking behind it. And I think that's something important to remember, because in today's time, one of the biggest banks, of course, is the JP Morgan Chase. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, one of the 5 biggest banks in America.
So there you go. I think if JP Morgan was alive today, he would want Amazon and Google.
Absolutely.
He would want it all. He would be like, I'm going to buy Amazon and Google. We'll throw Yahoo in there.
He would have already
AOL.
He would have shut down AOL at this point. Right.
Right. And that's just the type of guy he was. Obviously, we have a lot of really good laws today that kind of keeps power from being consumed in that type of way. And we've come across almost vilifying him in some ways. The JP Morgan, though, that I know from history, it wasn't necessarily, he wasn't trying to be a villain in all cases. A lot of times, he just could not stand prices being all over the place.
Right.
He really liked the idea of consolidating a business and having a payable wage and a payable price that everybody could actually have access to the products.
Well, and it's interesting because that time period, so the way that we get out of the Gilded Age, the way that we get out of that big business mentality is the Progressive Era. And the Progressive Era, if I had to sum it up in one word, is the word efficiency. But the fight is to get better working conditions, to get better pay for workers, and to kind of reform society. And it almost makes no sense that we think of JP Morgan, we think of him as efficient. We think of him as paying the right wages. We think of him as doing all the right things. And it really, when you look at progressivism, he's kind of one of the leaders.
Absolutely.
But he's also being seen as one of those big business guys. He's on both sides of things. So you look at Rockefeller or Vanderbilt or Carnegie or all the rest of them, we end up calling them in history robber barons, right?
Right.
Where they are getting rich at the expense of the workers. If someone dies on the job, it's okay because their neighbor can come work, right? It doesn't matter. JP Morgan, again, not about the industry, all about the money. He sees both sides. Now, he just wants to make the top dollar, but he is going to be seen as one of those progressive leaders. And that's something that's very interesting because you look at the enemies of progressivism being the big businessmen, but then again, there's JP Morgan sitting off to the side.
Right. So when you lay your head on your pillow tonight, think about JP Morgan for just a second. He is the reason that a lot of the luxuries we have in this country today do not exist in other countries in the world.
Absolutely.
And he is, by far, in my opinion, one of the single most important people of the United States history that gave our economic engine its start and its fuel, which lasts today, and that's the reason that we are one of the greatest countries
Absolutely.
in the world.
You look at the companies that are left from him, the top being, of course, General Electric, AT&T, also to thank JP Morgan, and then, of course, JP Morgan and Chase Company, which
quite possibly loaned you the money for your house.
Oh, absolutely, right? So I was, you look at those top banks, and the banking system in America is very different. We don't have a central bank, but we have the Federal Reserve, which is a central bank.
Right.
But we have these massive banks that are making all the business happen, and that's JP Morgan Chase, that's Wells Fargo, that's a few others that are doing this. But you're exactly right. I think when we look at the end of the day, we have so much to thank to JP Morgan, and not just for the, we could thank Edison for the inventions, we could thank Carnegie for the skyscrapers.
And Vanderbilt for the railroad.
Right, absolutely. But you look at JP Morgan, who we can thank for saving it all, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Let's go!